Hello, and welcome to Market Pulse, part of our Faster Forward podcast series at Northern Trust. My name's Grant Johnsey, and I am head of our Client Solutions Group in the Americas and our Capital Markets Division. This is going to be part 2 of our discussion on energy. I'm joined today by Parag Sanghani. He's from Westwood Holdings Group. Westwood is one of my closest clients. We do a lot of work with them over the years in the capital market side, and I'm delighted to have him join. It's a firm that does a lot of innovation and has a lot of expertise. Parag, we're going to be talking now about clean and renewable energy. And I got to admit, I'm really surprised how the world, despite all the investment in clean and renewables, is still mostly powered by fossil fuels and hydrocarbons. How long is this pivot going to take to more sustainable energy?
Yeah, Grant, that's a great question. And the reason is because 80% of the energy we use is fossil fuels.
Wow, 80%.
80%. So think of what we have to do. We use more energy every single year as a civilization. So not only do we need to provide the energy for that growth, but then we also need to replace the installed capacity of energy in the process. So there's just a lot of investment that needs to take place in order to really reduce our reliance on fossil fuels as we look forward 10, 15, 20 years. And the way I think of it is, really it comes down to the way a lot of people talk about the energy transition. They talk about it as if it's going to happen with just batteries, just solar, just wind. And they don't stop to think of what historically has happened. And I've seen a lot of analysis out there where they talk about, well, when we went to the oil age, we still used coal, right? And in fact, we used more coal in 2022 than we ever had any prior year before.
Wow.
As a civilization. So coal demand peaked in 2022, and that was only 2 years ago, so maybe it hasn't peaked yet.
Wow.
So when we think of where we are in this replacement cycle, one, I think the analogy of oil to coal is wrong. When we think of what is going to substitute fossil fuels, I like to think of the analogy of oil to whale oil. And so whale oil was used in the 1860s, 1870s. Whale oil was used to light the lanterns, in the streets of London, for example. And when a better product became available in the 1880s, which was kerosene from oil, that replacement cycle happened very quickly. And the reason it happened quickly, in my opinion, is because you already had the infrastructure in place to use the kerosene. All you had to do was replace the fuel. And so it was a relatively easy switch. And then you had drilling technology improved to the point where you were able to extract the oil cheaply. You went through the process of refining, et cetera, right? So the industry grew around, hey, this is a good substitution for whale oil. And that replacement took a really short period of time, 20 years or so, and you stopped whaling altogether. Transitioning to electric is going to take a lot longer. Electricity has been around for over 100 years now. Yet, when I went back to India as a kid in the 1980s, my grandparents lived on a farm, and they only had electricity 3 hours a day.
Wow, that's it.
That's it. So we had to do all of our cleaning, all of the laundry, all of the water, because you had to pump the water out with the pumps, etc. We had to do all of that early in the morning for the 3 hours that we had power. Otherwise, you just weren't going to have...
Couldn't get it done. Yeah.
Exactly. So here we are 100 years or whatever, 80 years after electricity is pretty widespread, yet there's still not enough infrastructure built to get it to every household. Now you go back to India today, and everywhere you go, they've got 24-hour power. But it took a long time to get that electric infrastructure built, even though everyone wanted it, right? And it's because it was a wholesale change in the way we were using energy. So the way I think of what's going to happen over the next, say, 15, 20, 30, 50 years is we use electricity today. So switching from coal to, say, natural gas, that's easy. It's very similar, turbines, very similar process. Switching to solar and wind, it's actually a little bit more difficult because those are intermittent sources. They require battery storage. They require different components for a grid to operate, but it's still manageable because you're still be able to recycle a lot of the existing infrastructure. But it takes a little bit longer, right? So when I think of the opportunity of switching our electric grid towards renewables, that can probably happen over a relatively reasonable time period because a lot of the infrastructure is in place. But then switching to EVs, switching to this whole backbone of everything being electric, that's going to take a lot longer simply because we don't have the infrastructure in place for all of that to happen. And that might take, probably less than 100 years, but it won't take just 15, 20 years to achieve.
The electrification will take much longer then.
Exactly.
Interesting. So, clean energy has been a pretty difficult environment to invest in, at least in the public markets. How are you approaching it at Westwood? How are you thinking about investing in clean renewables?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we have a mutual fund that invests in broad energy infrastructure, so not just midstream infrastructure. And there, the real opportunity today is predominantly on the grid and on storage. So if we look at the grid, the amount of new infrastructure that needs to be built, particularly around transformers, these are just literally just grid equipment, switches, gearboxes, etc., right? Just being able to make the grid resilient to this intermittent power is in the order of tens of billions of dollars. So companies like Quanta Services, for example, are investments that we have in the mutual fund portfolio. And that's, in my opinion, the best way today to access that market. When we think of the need for new power generation, we need new turbines. So we've seen recently a lot of new announcements for nuclear. Well, how are you going to bring that nuclear to the forefront? You're going to need the capacity to build that. So a company like GE Verona, GEV, those are companies that are going to be part of this modernization and transition of our electric grid.
Interesting. Are there any innovations or developments you're following right now in clean renewable energies that you think might really make a big difference? How are you thinking about innovations right now?
Yeah, what's really interesting is particularly on batteries and in solar, both of those sectors are very tech heavy and they're evolving very rapidly. So if we think of solar becomes right around 3% more efficient every year, and costs come down right around 3% every year. So 3 times 3, you're becoming 9% better year over
From
year.
a cost perspective.
From a cost perspective, probably like a per unit perspective. Now, if you look at the actual chart, it's faster than that, but those are nice round numbers to use any given year. And when we see that on the solar, we say, okay, what's that next incremental change? Well, it's material science. And material science is evolving very rapidly. We're seeing it in batteries as well, where a few years ago, it was lithium, cobalt, lithium, nickel, so on and so forth. Today, it's focused on a silicon anode. In the future, it might be a lithium anode, right? So you've got a lithium on both sides. Technology is changing really rapidly. Sodium batteries were really hyped up a few years ago. I think we're now finally starting to see the first deployment of those batteries. Sodium is plentiful in our Earth's crust. So having sodium chemistries for our batteries could lower the cost of grid storage substantially. And to put this in context, the Texas, for example, at peak demand, uses 84 gigawatts of power. That's 84,000 megawatts.
Wow.
Peak demand in summer month for
on a hot day, right?
On a hot day. We're adding gigawatts of battery storage to the grid that's coming online over the next couple of years.
In Texas.
In Texas. Just Texas. Gigawatts.
Wow.
So we're going to have a lot of backup capacity on the grid for those hot days.
So instead of storing minutes of power, hopefully that's hours at some point.
Exactly, at some point. Now that's going to take years to get there. And then think about multiplying that across a 4 terawatt system, 4,000 gigawatts across the US.
Wow.
It will take a long time, but it can happen. But we'll see a lot of change in these chemistries over the years with capacity being increased on the battery side and the productive capacity of solar improving over the years.
That's interesting. So really the battery development, battery innovation, something that you're closely monitoring, and that's critical if we are to build in some of these renewables because they're they've got lower factor capacity basically.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I love actually giving the numbers, and a lot of people go to sleep if you want to hear these numbers, but nuclear runs all the time. right? Like 95% of the time, we have to be down for maintenance. Natural gas runs right around 40% of the time. Part of that is that you need that natural gas generation whenever you're peaking in demand. So you have to create that excess
So you can
capacity.
turn it on
So you
if
can turn it
yes.
on. Exactly. So there has to be that extra capacity. Coal is being phased out. So today coal runs a little bit shy of 40% of the time. Right? Same thing. They do peak it up whenever demand is there, but they're in process. We've seen coal retirements year in, year out here in the United States. But then you start going down the grid and you say, okay, well, wind runs when it runs, solar runs about 30% of the time, right? And what that is it only works 12 hours a day on average, and then on when it's running, it only runs at 70%, right? So that's how you get to right around a third.
So cloudy day, it's not running as much. In the morning and the afternoon, it's not as much direct sunlight. So that's how you get to more like 30%.
Exactly. So when we look at this grid and we say, how is this grid going to grow? Well, we know we're going to add solar. We know we're going to add batteries. It's economic to do so. It costs around $35 a megawatt, right? Problem is it only works a third of the time. So what else are we going to add? And, we look at these recent nuclear announcements and they're a bit of a head scratcher. I didn't think it would happen because even a restart of 3 Mile Island, people are talking this is north of $100 a megawatt to do a restart. Let alone a new and small modular reactors are north of $200 a megawatt to build.
And to put that in comparison, what's $40 to $50 a megawatt is typically what you would see with renewables. Is that a fair
That's right.
number?
So 35 for solar. My understanding is you can get a brand new natural gas plant built for around 80.
Wow.
So it's mind-boggling to me that the nuclear is happening. So I'll be
at higher price points, but to your point, maybe they're paying that higher price point because it's more reliable on demand energy then.
That's right. And obviously because of the low carbon footprint.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point too with nuclear. Yeah. That's interesting. So if you think about, you talked a lot about solar. How do you compare that to say biofuels, hydro, wind, and solar? Like, what do you think that mix looks like going forward in the future?
So biofuels are really expensive. And even if we scale, they're still going to be relatively expensive to some of the other alternatives. But there's a place for them. And the reason there's a place for them is in areas where you're in remote locations or say aviation where you're going to where weight is an issue. We are going to use those fuels to offset the carbon intensity of those projects. So whether it's transportation or whether it's heavy industry or heavy work that needs to be done in remote locations. That from a magnitude standpoint is just not that large, right? So today we use 100 million barrels a day of oil. 70% of that is transportation, right? Round numbers. Biofuels can probably take a 10% wedge, realistically. And then that's over time, right? Jet fuel today is like 4 to 5 million barrel a day demand market.
Wow.
So it's just from a magnitude standpoint, it's just small, but it's not inconsequential. Every little bit helps.
What about solar versus wind and hydro then?
Solar in my mind makes the most sense. And the reason solar makes the most sense is you need to cover the sun is just really energy intense at the end of the day is what it comes down to. You need to, I think the quote is, in 3 minutes, we get as much energy from the sun as we as a human civilization use in a year.
Wow.
Right. Problem is you can't capture 100% of that ever, right? The best solar cells will translate about 25%. Theoretical limits are about 35, 40%. So there is a limitation there. And actually you're seeing technology improve to where you're getting into the high 20s, and those solar cells hopefully will come out in the next few years.
And that's just where at a certain point you just hit a limit of thermodynamics. You just can't get more out of it.
Any more out of it. But when you run the math, you only need to cover a land area the size of France. I think this was clearly intended for an international market because Texas is the same size as France. So you only need to cover a land area the size of Texas to power
with solar panels.
With solar panels to power all of the world.
Oh wow!
Right. So realistically, battery and solar should get us most of the way there. It will never get us 100% of the way there because the sun doesn't always shine.
Interesting.
Right.
But that's why in your capacity is such a big part of this. How about overall investments in capacity, say, versus energy production? as well as distribution. Where do you see those investments playing out over, say, the next 10 years or so?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So near term, we've underinvested in our grid. Power demand in the United States has basically been flat for 20 years. It's grown at less than 0.1% a year from 2000 to 2023, right? So here we are growing demand by many estimates north of 1%. Realistically, it's going to be something right around 1% a year. Well, that's a lot because you're going from an industry that was not growing to an industry that's growing, and the installed base is massive. So you've got this massive installed base that's now growing 1% a year. Everything's going to break as we start doing this. And so the grid is first and foremost. There's just billions and billions of dollars that need to be invested in the grid itself. That's where you see a lot of those Eatons and your Quanta Services of the world really seeing a lot of demand growth. And then beyond that, it's going to come down to how do we bring that power and translate it into what should be an EV market, what should be, a broader electrification of everything that we do. The truth is the technology doesn't exist today to convert wholesale to electric power. So we do need advances in technology. We do need reduction in cost for us to eventually get to an electric economy.
So Parag, you mentioned 1% electricity growth on what's really been 20 years of no growth. And that seems a little surprising to me because we've got efficiency and lights, we've got efficiency and, electronics and obviously, automobiles. Where's that electricity demand starting to come from that leads you to believe that we're going to see an increase in electricity demand?
Yeah, a lot of it is coming from AI data centers in addition to the electrification of transportation. So when you combine those two, we're looking at tremendous amount of growth relative to where we have been, right? Basically zero, growing 1% a year now. And what that means is we need a lot more natural gas pipelines going to utilities. We need a lot more capacity to handle that power generation at the grid level. And that means a lot more investment.
Interesting. And we talked about in the prior podcast when we were focused more on traditional energy in part one of this series, you had talked a lot about natural gas and how you see both growth in supply and demand continuing to accelerate here over the next 5 to 10 years. And you also mentioned how nat gas could be part of decarbonization. Like, how does that work? Because when you burn natural gas, you still have carbon dioxide that is being produced. How do you see natural gas fitting into the clean and renewable energy pivot that we're going down?
Yeah, absolutely. When we think of this concept of net zero, the reason we say net zero is because we're not going to have zero emission everything. It doesn't make sense to have zero emission everything. So there's going to be some emissions, and then we'll offset those emissions with negative carbon sinks, right? So natural gas is the most efficient way of using a fossil fuel. It creates the least amount of carbon dioxide per unit of energy released, simply because of the constitute of the molecule, right? It's only one carbon atom with 4 hydrogen atoms. So you've got the highest ratio of hydrogen to carbon, 4-to-1.
And as I understand it, breaking those hydrogen bonds is what really releases the energy. So
Correct.
The more hydrogen relative to carbon in the fossil fuel, the more efficient and less polluting it is. Is that a kind of way to think about it?
That's exactly right. So natural gas, I think, is going to win from a fossil fuel standpoint. But within the context of what is the most energy efficient way of making the things we need to make. So when we think of plastics, for example, it is much more efficient to convert ethane to ethylene than it is to take natural gas, heat it up, get the molecules mixed up, and then convert it over. That's a much more energy intensive process. It's going to end up being a lot more regressive from a carbon output standpoint. So ethane to ethylene, propane to propylene, those things are going to continue to happen. So when we look at the value chain of hydrocarbons, we're going to be using all of them for a really long time in large amounts, in large quantities. And then the offsets are going to be carbon sinks. Forests are great carbon sinks. And so the key here really is to sequester that carbon dioxide over time. And then ultimately, if carbon sequestration from an injection standpoint will work, which is what companies like ExxonMobil are working on, actually taking that carbon, at the source and injecting it into the ground.
Back into the ground. So capturing essentially that carbon.
Exactly. That in itself could also be a pathway towards decarbonization. And I think one thing that everyone needs to remember is that we need to be pragmatic about this. Just because a fossil fuel is a fossil fuel doesn't make it environmentally bad. There are worse alternatives and there are better alternatives. But if you can take a fossil fuel with all this installed capacity and then sequester the carbon, you've now got a decarbonized fuel that can power the world, and that is good for society. That's not a bad thing. And I think that a lot of people forget that our goal here is to take the steps necessary to get to decarbonization. We're not going to get there in one shot.
And you really need some energy sources like, say, natural gas or nuclear that are on demand and can offset some of the renewables that maybe don't have that ability to turn the wind on or to turn the sun on. So you've got to have a balance, it sounds like.
That's right. And there's a lot of research going into doing this. There's a company we were talking about earlier, Net Power, that is working on taking the natural gas, capturing the carbon at the source, and then injecting it into the ground and using that process to actually have a decarbonized power generation using natural gas. So it's a really interesting strategy that they're employing. And it looks like it could turn out to be a highly economic way of using more natural gas for power generation in the future if it works.
And they're building a plant up right now down in West Texas to test this.
That's exactly right.
Interesting. That'll be interesting to check in. What's the estimate when that's going to be done?
So they've got a test plant, and then they're going to build a full-scale plant. That one's going to be a 2026 event.
Okay, so pretty soon we'll get a sense. Yeah, interesting. Speaking of carbon sequestering, I know that's an element in the Inflation Reduction Act. How do you think the Inflation Reduction Act generally is going to play out in the energy markets, particularly the clean and renewable side of things? How is that going to impact things?
Yeah, what's really interesting is they had a little bit of everything and it's such a badly worded bill, but in the Inflation Reduction Act, they had a little bit of everything. They had carbon sequestration, they had a little bit of value for hydrogen, they had a little bit of value for wind, for solar, for batteries, you name it. They just basically threw a bunch of subsidies at the wall to see what sticks. And what we're finding now, we're 2 years removed from the signing of that bill now, and what we're finding is hydrogen's got a lot more work to do. It's turning out to be a little bit more expensive. It's turning out a little bit more complicated. So that's still in wait and see mode. When we look at carbon sequestration, ExxonMobil's made several splashes. Other companies have talked about, particularly in the midstream space, have talked about the value of some of these tax credits. DT Midstream is doing a project on carbon sequestration just off of their existing facilities. So you are seeing movement there. And at $80 a ton for sequestering carbon, it's looking like it's turning out to be an economic solution. So the great thing about these things is this is really new. And whenever you do something that's really new, it's really expensive. You do it 1,000 times over, it becomes a lot cheaper per unit. And so I wouldn't be surprised if this $80 a ton jumpstarts the industry on carbon sequestration, and then eventually the costs for doing this come down to the point where you can actually have a carbon tax and it's not onerous.
Interesting. So there are companies that are starting to change how they're investing in energy based upon the Inflation Reduction Act.
That's right.
Tell me, you mentioned ExxonMobil. I mean, some people have the sense, I think, that some of these big oil giants are behind the times and they're eventually going to be, no pun intended, dinosaurs. How are they trying to rethink their business, the Exxons and the Chevrons and BPs of the world? How are they approaching clean and renewable energy? You mentioned carbon sequestering. What else are they doing to kind of think about how they can remain relevant?
It's really interesting. A few years ago, companies like Shell and BP talked about targeting less oil production 10 years down the road, and they've all walked that back now. They're like, oh no, we're going to invest in hydrocarbons. We're going to do this because that's what we do. But they're also investing in the sequestration technologies, right? I think having trillions of dollars invested in a fuel source that you are then going to say, oh, we're not going to use this because we have to invest a few $100 billion more to make it decarbonized. It just doesn't make any sense. The whole world is geared towards fossil fuels. Carbon sequestration is part of the solution. And so we're seeing the companies invest predominantly in sequestration. Darren Woods is very public saying that Exxon is in the business of molecules, not electrons. So, really focused on hydrocarbon molecules, not the power generation side of things. So you're seeing that they're really refocusing on their core competency of producing energy, and they're trying to do it in a way that is less carbon intensive in each step of the way.
Interesting. So hypothetically, if we've got this big presidential election coming up in a few weeks. If you're appointed as Secretary of Energy, what would you want to see the United States embark on? One kind of project or one goal over the next 4 years to try to make this pivot. How would you approach that? Like, what is your thinking to try to make this pivot to clean and renewables happen?
Yeah, it comes down to batteries. Ultimately, it comes down to, do we have the storage to have more intermittency? And the IRA takes a lot of steps to get there. I think that whoever comes into office, large portions of it will remain intact, simply because a lot of the investment that's, if Trump wins, a lot of the investment that's going into making batteries domestically are happening in places like Georgia. And so there's just, the constituency wants to keep it. And so it probably stays. But more broadly, if we think of the limitations of renewable energy today, the limitations are predominantly intermittency. So reducing intermittency allows for larger deployment. We're not going to get to 100% anytime in the next 10, 15, 20, 40 years, maybe even. But we are incrementally getting there. And don't forget, getting to net zero in 2050, I'm pretty sure we're going to miss that. But if we get net negative in, say, 2070, the climate is thousands of years. It's not 10, 20-year increments. If we can get there and then actually go negative for a period of time, you do a lot to fix the problem.
To repair the environment, you clean the air as you go more negative, get that carbon sequestered.
It does end up shifting it by generation, so there might be a generation or two there that are not happy with the situation. But as a global climate, as a species, if we can get us there in a reasonable period of time, it's not going to be the end of the world, so to speak.
It's a very tricky pivot and transition for aforementioned reasons. All right, thanks, Parag. That was really fascinating. I really appreciate you joining me today. And thanks to you all, our listeners and our viewers today, for tuning in to the second part of our discussion on energy topics. If you missed part one, please do tune into that one where we talk about traditional energy with Parag. Thanks again. This is Grant Johnsey from Market Pulse, and I appreciate you all for joining.